Hello, everyone. I'm Agah Karakuzu. I'm a PhD student at Polytechnique Montreal, and today we are going to talk about an article titled On Modeling, which is published 2 years ago in MRM. And we have the honor to have all the authors of this article today, Dmitry Novikov, Valery Kiselev, and Sunej Jespersen. And I am also really happy to be on this call with them because if there were a fun club for this article, I think I would be an avid member. The article is about identifying the problems undermining the clinical potential of microstructure mapping methods, mostly focusing on diffusion imaging, and establishing a framework of thinking that can help solve them. So I will start this panel by giving a 15 to 20 minutes long presentation to cover some important concepts that are presented in the article. And I did my best to make it fun and easier to understand and hope that it works. And after the presentation, we will have our Q&A session with the authors. So if our participants allow, I'm going to start the presentation now.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so I really enjoy contrasting examples, and I think Minecraft versus microstructure mapping using MRI is one of them. So Minecraft is this famous video game where you use blocks to build a small world and survive in it. And the nominal resolution of Minecraft is at the scale of meters because game developers roughly design these blocks and they don't care about capturing some fine details. So everything below a meter scale is ignored. And this particular design renders megastructure building as one of the coolest tasks in the game. And players take their time to build these fascinating detailed structures from these meter-long cubes of different colors. It's really fascinating. And they have a large community. They have nearly around 200 million players today. But the average profile is 15, 13 years old with a computer and an internet connection, nothing but it. But in case of MRI, we are imaging building blocks of what already exists, and the nominal resolution in this game is in the scale of millimeters. And unlike game developers, we cannot color these cubes as we like, but it is determined by the signal we measure. And this signal is a complex composition of micrometer level effective parameters, and every other physical interaction below this scale is smoothed over, such as quantum molecular dynamics. But unlike these Minecraft developers, we are highly interested in the details that underlie these blocks. And to do that, we are left with fundamental parameters, PD, T1, T2, T2 star, and our scanners with limited measurement power. And I think this challenge makes our coolest game the microstructure mapping. And our community is not in the scale of millions, but we can clearly see that the number of microstructure mapping studies grew exponentially over the last few years. And our community profile is neither to compare with that of Minecraft. We need people with PhDs. And as a PhD student, this is how I split the requirements in my mind. So there are various technical challenges that lay in front of us, and we need to learn about MRI physics and how pulse sequences and MRI hardware relate to it. Then we need to develop some coding skills in several programming languages. We need to read and write papers and sometimes catch up with the trends such as deep learning. But we also need a deeper learning, and there are some fundamental concepts and questions that contribute to the PH component of the degree we are seeking, I believe, such as what's the difference between a model and a representation, what is an effective theory, what is coarse graining, and how are they linked to each other? Is this physics or just fitting data? And the thing is, there are more papers and resources than we can read in a lifetime about these orange lists, but we don't get to read that many papers talking about the philosophical elements of research in the context of MRI. And I think in this regard, the On Modeling paper is a true gem. So the concept of coarse graining and selecting relevant degrees of freedom to create an effective theory are really important to understand the gist of this article. So I try to come up with an analogy to explain them. So imagine that you are going on a 100 kilometers long road trip by bike, and you'd like to estimate how long it's going to take. And obviously, this is not an easy, right? And probably there are thousands of random factors affecting it. But after some biking experience, you get to know which parameters effectively contribute to the duration of your trip. And tire pressure is one of them. If you have this 28 millimeter tires and you weigh about 85 kilograms like I do, you know that 80 psi front and 75 psi rear tire pressure is optimal so that it rolls quickly and it's still comfortable. Then you check if your crankset and chain working properly. So in this case, your coarse grain parameter is binary. And how much extra weight you have is quite critical. You measure it in kilograms and probably don't care about that weight changes because of the small variations in the gravitational acceleration during your road trip. And then the outside temperature, it has an impact on your performance. But again, you wouldn't care about the speed of individual particles around you as a measure of temperature. But this is because we find descriptions that match what we actually see and interact with. And in this case, it is the temperature in Celsius. And here comes the final boss, probably the most important parameter, the elevation gain. You need to know for how long you'll be climbing uphill. So now we have all the relevant degrees of freedom, but still estimating how long it will take is not straightforward. It is somewhere between 4 and 5 hours. But if you're geeky enough, you can come up with some estimation method. Then you can say that you have a useful model for bike routes because now you have an effective theory and a parameter estimation method. And now imagine the same problem, but now you have a Tesla car. Obviously, you need to update your effective theory because there is almost nothing you should worry about what's under the hood. You have these 4 green bars on your battery indicator. I think it's more than enough for 100 kilometers. For the tire, 5 psi less or more is not relevant anymore. You coarse grain this feature into a binary parameter in this case. And if your autonomous driver license is still valid, you just sit back and arrive at your destination in 1 hour. So luxury is coarse-grained experience with less number of relevant parameters in this case. And as you can see, effective theory is how we approach the world. We can't keep track of all the information simultaneously. We focus on what is accessible and we relate to them. And in this example, the effect of vehicle is the most obvious to us. But it's also important to realize that in the same continuum of 60 miles, we had 2 effective theories at 2 different scales. So if you've ever taken a long road trip by bike, you know what I mean. It literally makes you feel much smaller than you are. And here comes the $1 million question. In the continuum of the complex human body, how do we access the information hidden in the microscale using an instrument that operates at the scale of millimeters? So we need to solve this problem at a level where limitations of our effective theory allow us to capture that underlying microstructural information correctly, even after a substantial coarse graining after going to the macro scale. And the scale we need in this case is the mesoscale, which leads us to the arena of transverse magnetization. And it has this famous mesoscopic block Tori equation written on its walls. And the number 1 rule in such arena is that you do talk about modeling, which has 2 important steps. The first one is identifying relative tissue-specific parameters that contribute to the terms in this equation. So which is building an effective theory for the macroscopic signal that we observe after a massive coarse graining. And the second one is solving the parameter estimation problem. We need to find optimal ways to quantify these parameters. And combination of these 2 gives us models. And obeying these rules of this arena less or more strictly and being less or more specific about the underlying tissue microstructure, there are tons of diffusion-based gladiators, but none of them are free yet. And I think this quote in the article has a stark explanation as to why. It says, advanced diffusion acquisition and models just seem to be mathematical magic tricks for new grants and publications. We are still using the diffusion trace for everything. So despite 2 decades of financial and intellectual investment, the progress is slow. And the article says there is a fundamental problem disguised and formulates it under 4 main issues. I'll get to them, but first I think we need to recognize the difference between models and representations. A model is a true biophysical characterization of the underlying microstructure, whereas representations are convenient mathematical formulas that fit the data well. And drawing this line, this red line, is essential to formulate this slow progress problem. And it's not simply about adhering to a terminologically correct academic writing. We should adopt this distinction into our framework, into our framework of thinking about microstructure mapping. When we can't draw that line, this happens. People fit unphysical model to data and nobody bats an eye. Then they cannot validate it and everyone loses their mind. Because when there is no theoretical basis, quantitative maps become subjective to over-interpretations. Then we see hundreds of correlational studies come to the surface to explore what those quantitative maps mean through interventions or observing pathology. So one loud and clear message from this article is that only physical models can be validated. And representations are proper mathematical formulas. This is the good old bioexponential representation of the diffusion signal. And since 1994, it is known that if we collect the signal in at least 6 different directions, we can fit for the diffusion tensor. But if rank 2 tensors are not good enough for you, then you can go interstellar on your diffusion signal and estimate parameters for higher order terms and calculate diffusion kurtosis tensors, which has more to offer compared to DTI. While doing so, we should also think about the gap between our research interest and the clinical reality. I think in research settings, we are lucky to work on powerful scanners with 300 meter per millitesla per meter, high performance gradients that allows us to acquire data at high B values and more directions. Whereas in clinics, this is rarely the case. And there is also this important issue of sensitivity versus specificity. Yes, the maps may become more sensitive to pathology when we crank up our scanner to the max, but ultimately we would like to become specific to the underlying tissue microstructure. And this is why we should tell representation from model so that we can know what we can claim and what we cannot. Otherwise, we run into statements like this: diffusion in tissues is non-Gaussian, contrary to what DTI assumes, so DTI is wrong. So taking as a model, no one should use DTI. DTI is useful as a representation, and this proper terminology can guard against such unfair criticism. Whereas models are sketches of reality. For example, the most common picture represents neurites as infinitely narrow, impermeable sticks. And it consists of at least 2 compartments, intra and extra-axonal compartments with 2 parameters for both of them, radial and parallel diffusivities. And some models take CSF compartment into account as well. But the most important thing here is that you see we need a picture of what we are working with equations. So there are many models based on this picture, and they all have different assumptions. For example, some models assume that there is no water exchange and the dominant contribution to the diffusion signal arises from the intra-axonal space, and use this approach to probe axonal diameter. So this strong assumption that extra-axonal diffusion is time independent was one of the outstanding matter of debates in the field. But what is common among all the models is that they strive to be specific. For example, radial diffusivity increases as a response to demyelination edema or axonal loss. But to tell them from each other, model-based metrics can be more useful. Yet, as the paper says, there are 4 fundamental issues with the modeling. The first one is poor biophysical models, which happens, for example, when you miss out the dominant physical effect. So that assumption I talk about, that the diffusion time depends solely on the intra-axonal water, fails at low gradients because of the residual extra-axonal signal. Or maybe can we say that axonal diffusion can be non-Gaussian because in the end, axons are not ideal tubes. And the second problem is the degeneracies in parameter estimation. And it has two components, bimodality and flatness. This bimodality happens when two model parameters mimic the signal equally well. For example, this triangle becomes degenerate when side z almost equals to the summation of the sides x plus y. And the second one is the flatness of loss function minima. It's a measure of how sensitive your estimation parameter changes and how well it generalizes. And well, if you're lacking a theoretical foundation or the physical origin of the signal is incompatible with your equations, then the estimated parameters are meaningless. And the last one is the problem of decoupling biological variability. And this is ultimately what we want, but it's not an easy task because there are lots of variabilities involved in what we are doing. Some of them are coming from acquisition, some of them from modeling and implementation variabilities. So how we study matters, so does how we communicate. We need to think about the role of our society in improving communication as well. And we have different sub-communities in ISMRM, and each of them almost have their own language. And we should find ways to break these different eggs to make a community omelet that has a coherent taste and nutritious for everyone. Because good science communication is important to make decisions about models. So when we ask the question, which model is right, we first identify whether it's a model or a representation. And we need good communication platforms within our community that can hopefully build new theories and models and maintain a common knowledge base by constantly questioning existing models and subjecting them to novel validation methods. And if we can achieve this, then we can think about exchanging knowledge with other fields as well through theory development, mathematical formulation, and validation. So bottom line, there is nothing more practical than a good theory. And there is only one correct theory, and others are consequently incorrect. This is with reference to the figure 2 in the article, by the way. And the correct theory is very, very useful, such as Mona Lisa symbolizes a change in styles and the development of the arts. But validating it is very, very hard because we also know that Da Vinci said he never finished a work. All right.
Great.
Great.
Yeah, this is wonderful to see. Somebody else has read the article and distilled it for themselves. It's really quite a time investment. Thank you, Aga.
Very creative.
I really like illustrations.
Yeah. So maybe just if I can jump in, the right statement, the last statement that you made, we do say this. There is only one correct theory. There are multiple representations that can fit data equally well because there is infinite number of complete bases and space of functions. There is only one correct theory or one correct model, but at a given coarse graining scale, right? So it's as your example of bike ride or Tesla ride, you have to specify at which level you coarse grain the problem, and then indeed there is one correct model, one correct theory, and finding it is difficult.
Yeah, thank you so much for clarifying that for people. Sune, Valerie, do you have any comments before we start with the Q&A?
I think you did a great job. It was very clear and very pedagogical and very creative. So I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, me too. I enjoyed really. Maybe we can go on discussing because just commenting on your presentation, it's so self-consistent. So just don't disturb it.
Okay, then I'm going to start with my questions. And so the article here not only identifies problems, but also provides a thinking and problem-solving framework. And I think it's really, really important so that we can improve our models in the context of diffusion-based microstructure mapping. So my first question is mostly for Dimitri. which model or models pop up into your head as the most controversial for suffering from these problems a lot? And it has been 2 years since you published this article. Were there any studies that applied the framework you presented in the article to make things better?
Well, indeed, let's start from the end. Indeed, a lot has happened over the past couple of years, and maybe even, let's say, the trend really has been the past 3-5 years, where I would say that the overall standards in the modeling standards in diffusion and microstructure community has risen quite a lot. So I'll say that generally I'm extremely optimistic about where the community is going. So there was a time, maybe circa 2015, where these debates were really kind of raging during the microstructure sessions at SMRM, workshops, etc., where indeed there were a lot of models with assumptions that were ad hoc. You mentioned axonal diameter mapping, which was questionable. We can discuss that, or maybe famous constraints in NODI. But in general, the community has been rising to the challenge. And in a way, this article on modeling had been written for about over 2 years. I think we started around 2016 or maybe end of 2015. And it took almost 2.5 years and 20 plus versions, and talking between three of us to sort of formulate what are the issues, indeed, what are the fundamental issues, how to think about things, but also how to make it better. And the hardest part, of course, is validation. Everything can fit a signal in the typical clinical range of parameters, and therefore there is no way to tell which model is right. You can fit a polynomial to almost anything and it will fit. Doesn't mean that polynomial is a model of any physical process. And so I think what we really cared about in this article, and maybe what kind of you didn't touch upon in this presentation, is that we're really advocating this sort of physics-based way of validating, which is really focusing on the testing of the functional form of dependence of your signal or whatever you measure on the parameters that you can vary on a scanner, for instance, right? So you really want to probe your model when you can take your experimental parameter far away, far enough where the model assumptions will lead to a very particular functional dependence on the parameters relative to any other sort of competing model. Or the model stops being expandable as a polynomial and starts to behave, say, non-analytically on a parameter in question. And an example is, for instance, we all know that indeed the diffusion signal is a regular function of p-value, exponential. Logarithm of a signal is like expandable in Taylor series, bd, and then kurtosis times b squared. So this is regular polynomial expansion. It doesn't tell you anything about the assumptions because anything has this polynomial expansion. But if you, for instance, the example you showed, take a signal from very narrow axons and go to a very large p-value, then it turns out that the signal depends on p-value as 1 over square root of p. It has no expansion at b around 0, and this function is non-analytic in p. And if you actually go all the way to the values of b, which are large enough, you could actually spot this behavior. You suddenly can say with a very high certainty that whatever I see is coming from inside axons, because that is a very concrete function with very concrete assumptions. This actually has been used.
It has used the word signature very often.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and if one could also add here that I think this ties very well into one of the key differences between models and representations, because models basically allow you to predict things. For example, predict how it will behave in a range of parameters very far from where it was first established. Whereas if you do the same thing increase the B range, for example, for representations, you'll actually see that the model or the representation parameters will vary with the B value. So in essence, they are partly saying something about your measurement, not the system. So this is the kind of validation thinking from physics, that the predictive power that models have will allow you to validate them in such a way.
So just to give an example, you apply bi-exponential representation and your so-called volume fractions start depending on the B range.
Exactly.
The interval. So that's a typical sign that something is not correct.
Exactly.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. This was a really thorough answer. And the second question is going to be for Sune mostly, but of course it's always open for everyone. So from theory to a research implementation, it is a long journey and there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears go into it. And if I were to pick one of the papers I read as a handbook for it in quantitative diffusion imaging, on modeling article would be it. But what about going from a successful implementation to a clinical application? I mean, I was always wondering, is this even technically feasible anytime soon with the clinical settings that we see today when we go to a hospital? Because it's definitely much more different than what we have in our research sites. And how likely we are to run these sophisticated microstructural imaging protocols in clinical settings? What do you think?
Yeah, of course, it's always difficult to predict, especially about the future. But I think that well, first of all, we can of course hope that technology evolves, right? So I mean, the fact that something doesn't seem possible right now shouldn't prevent us to try to understand what we're looking at and try to imagine that maybe what can be possible in the future. Also, because there will be some feedback from once we gain better understanding of what is possible in principle on animal scanners outside the clinic, etc. That could also spur development of new technology, pushing for larger gradient strengths or whatever it might be. And also in general, I think it's, once we validate models or develop models and validate them, it will also teach us what to look for in clinical scans. I mean, the models will isolate the dependence of our signal on microstructural features and how we can estimate those parameters, meaning how do we optimize our sequences and it can teach us what exactly are we looking at. So I think all of this will improve the clinical applicability. But I also don't think it's so far away. I've seen many wonderful things on humans coming both from Freiburg and from NYU, where they actually do these things on living human beings and get out metrics that reveal, for example, beatings in axons in patients. So I think it's, in my view, it's very promising and not that far off.
Yeah, of course.
I would say that as a general rule, I fully agree with Sunya, first of all. And as a general rule, you usually have to say or write or publish a little bit, or you have to know more than you say and publish. Because science, if you want to build it on a solid ground, it is a pyramid. So your ground is more solid than the top, so to say, which is exactly maybe the subject of your most recent publication. So it's good to know, meaning in the animal scanner or very powerful research scanner, human scanner, you learn things and then you can restrict your parameters and predict what you can measure in a clinical scanner or what you cannot measure and so on. And at the same time, of course, as soon as you create a motivation for the technological development. You cannot do research, you cannot search with a blind around your eyes, you have to look around. That's kind of short summary.
Yeah, actually, if I may, I think there's a certain broader trend that we're also witnessing here is that we're finally, we're treating, maybe when microstructure has been percolating into the sort of broader MRI community and become an explosion of microstructure works and sessions at SMRM, I think it's really very healthy development, because what happens is that we stop treating our field as just biomedical imaging and start going back to our scientific roots and start treating it as a field of performing precise, reproducible physical measurements. And so even if it's a clinical scanner, it's a sophisticated measurement apparatus. It's quite well calibrated if you know what you're doing. And it needs to be calibrated on phantoms, and things need to be validated precisely. It's an instrument. It's not an imaging device. I recall I had an interesting conversation with one of the managers at one major scanner manufacturer, and I was suggesting, well, you know, why not have a scanner presenting sold as a measurement device with calibrations, with whatever error bars you guarantee on given phantoms for typical for basic parameters. And I was told, well, that's great, but it is sold as an imaging device, not as a physical measurement apparatus. But I think we need to change our thinking, and I think focusing on tissue microstructure, where the community has been probably ahead of everyone else in trying to carefully validate reproducibility of our parameters, diffusion metrics on phantoms and things like that, that maybe our thinking will come back to our scientific roots, and we stop look at MRI images as just some grayscale maps, but realize that each voxel is a measurement, and it has error bars, and it has assumptions. And this is a physical discipline, not that different from measuring Higgs boson mass. Or
so, then do you think that if the vendors are much slower than the scientific progress our community is making because of the red tapes that put, you know, in their progresses about not making it a measurement device, but say that we come up with really useful and practical measures, do you think that we can create that knowledge basis to properly manage that calibrations and everything with the people working on these microstructural imaging methods, such as using, for example, this ISMRM system Phantom, or what would that be? Because it's going to get much more complicated and pretty more expensive than the routine MRI maintenance tasks, right? So do you think that can we achieve this within community?
I think it's possible. I mean, our group, so Elsewhere, once our colleague and long-term collaborator, is a world expert on calibration and on built-in phantoms. We do it all the time. We know before even applying a new sequence, or even maybe scanner had a major upgrade, let's run phantom and let's actually get the absolute values of diffusion coefficient of some chemical substance like alkanes or water at zero temperature or whatnot. It's a basic culture that you don't think about when you look at it as just an image, but if you're looking at it as a physicist, you do it all the time. It's not that expensive.
Yeah, then the Phantom that I'm working on is a bit expensive. it's I'm just mostly working with relaxometry mapping methods.
The NIST Phantom.
Yeah,
we have it too.
That's great.
I suppose these kind of things are done with routinely for NMR spectrometers, right? So it shouldn't be that different.
Yeah, well, imaging has its own artifacts, so
sure.
it creates a layer of complexity, and that actually creates even more need for calibration and validation. Yeah.
And I can add maybe that for proper calibration, you have to have an adequate theory, actually. And historically, we have inherited a lot from NMR. So NMR typically done in solutions in a spectrometer. On one hand, it was real physical measurements. On the other hand, some simple approximations, which are actually implicitly assuming that you have a homogeneous medium, came in our community, in our way of thinking, which is sometimes just leads to errors. For example, there was such a method called vessel size imaging, where you have to compare gradient echo and spin echo. and conclude about the mean vessel size, which is about 10 micrometer, and your image resolution is like 2 millimeters, as you said at the beginning. And I noticed it, I don't know, several times, a typical beginner's mistake. One replaces spin echo with the fast spin echo, turbo spin echo rare, depending on the manufacturer, it's called differently, which is a CPMG with imaging. So from the NMR, old NMR point of view, nothing depends on the echo time. You have R2, full stop. In our real world, R2 is a function of all timing. It's time dependent, and replacing a spin echo, which was accounted for in theory, with a fast spin echo rare, whatever it's called, was really created crazy data sets. Untractable. Just one example how it works.
All right. So my next question then is going to be for Valerie in this case. It is, when do representations become useful, and how do we add value to representations in the circle of academia? Maybe it's also another important part of that question. I mean, are they mostly to keep our boat afloat while we are searching for the useful metric in this ever-growing ocean of correlational research? So what do you think?
Good question. So representations has, or at least one representation has demonstrated its power long ago when one discovered that diffusion coefficient in stroke drops about twofold in the damaged tissue. So it was a real finding of very important parameter, which was easy to measure. So it was really great. It is completely based on representation as a diffusion coefficient and correlation with the pathology. My picture, maybe I can make a comparison with a kind of mathematical image. On one hand, it's useful, indeed. You use representation, you can report your signal somehow, you can store it, you can discuss how it is correlated. But if you search for something which really signals you a pathology, or biomarkers, usually called, it depends on the number of parameters you are taking care about. Imagine I give you an analogy. You have a unit square, yeah, just 1, 1, 1. So just a square, and you write an encircled circle. So in 2 dimensions, it's like a target. You can close your eye, throw a dart, and with a very high probability, which is what it is, pi, r squared is the half of pi divided by 4. With the probability pi divided by 4, you hit the target, okay? So you find this, you have a very good finding. And now imagine that the number of parameters you are taking care of increases. Now we go to 3 dimensions. We have a cube with unit volume and a sphere in it touching the faces. Okay, you can calculate the probability of hitting it by chance, and so on. If you increase the number of dimensions, the probability of hitting by chance, so it's just the volume of the sphere relative to the unit volume of cube, goes down even faster than exponential. It's like a gamma function, it's like factorial. It goes to 0, which means that in principle, in a small number of dimensions, you can even search just by chance, just making this exhaustive search or whatever. In a very large number of dimensions, the probability of finding this piece of gold is very low, very low. And then theory, which is not representation, but theory will lead you to the source of knowledge, or to what you want to see. It will effectively reduce the number of dimensions you have to think about. So that's my picture in mind.
Do you have anything to add, Sunia or Dimitri?
No,
I mean,
that was quite exhaustive.
It's quite obvious that then we need to raise a lot of awareness about these topics within the community. And I know that your paper's one of the main purposes of your article is definitely that. But I think we need to build a positive feedback loop between sub-communities of ISMRM, right, to better understand these issues. And another important question is that when you start doing research in a lab, you probably don't have much control over what you are going to work on or which particular experimental design you're going to interact with. So how should early career researchers like me position themselves to be a part of such a solution? What do you think?
I think you positioned yourself by thinking a lot about these things already. I think maybe if I start, I think it's a really great question, and I'm very optimistic about the new crop sort of young early career researchers we constantly interact with. We organize conferences, sessions, and I think the culture has risen. The model and the appreciation of this kind of chasm between just fitting by something plausible and no, developing proper theory, validating assumptions. I'm actually quite impressed with this young generation of researchers in diffusion. And it's true that we need to maybe have better educational opportunities for people to learn intricacies of modeling. And maybe the sort of handicap of our field has still remained a little bit that it's been approached as a very applied engineering-driven field in a hospital usually, and model development theory, basic physics leading to deriving such models is not usually taught. It's not really a fault. It's just that the logic of the field has been for 2-3 decades to build better coils, to calibrate, to develop sequences, to make field more homogeneous and make sophisticated acquisition patterns, case-based trajectories and reconstruction methods. And it's all useful. It's just that there is another aspect which has only been touched upon sort of recently, which is what are the microscopic assumptions leading to our macroscopic measurements. And that is not really yet sort of taught at the level that sequence design or coil design is taught. And that I think is lagging, and we're trying to contribute to this, of course, but it's just a process. But maybe Valery or Sonia can add, Valery has been organizing this diffusion courses for SMRMB, and now we recently organized such a session in 2019 for SMRM, where we really pushed people to sort of have a hands-on experience of solving problems and deriving even relatively simple things, but actually sitting and deriving, and it changes people's perspective. We had quite a nice feedback about it. So maybe that's really what's needed today, just to bring us all at a higher level.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, when I think of learning how to code or how to apply any, software or anything to a data, I feel like the new beginner is a bit more like learning how to bike. Whereas when I think about learning how to model something, it's a bit more like ski jumping. How do you do it for the first time? I don't know. And I really need right, these kind of courses and activities so that I can improve myself on it. And what do you suggest to people who are interested in that? Like, let's say I have free time and I'd like to fiddle with numbers, to do something other than courses that happens annually or 2-3 times in a year. What would be a good practice for people? Because I'm an engineer, I'm not a physicist. I definitely did more technical drawing, coding, and such than driving mathematical formulas. But I am aware of its importance. And if I want to improve myself, what do I need to do?
I would say that you already described what to do. Because if you compare with sports, I can show you some places in Swiss Alps, for example, where all skiers go just very complicated way. And when they have really downhill, they jump over that without making a turn. And you already described, yeah, you don't need to jump actually, but you need to understand that this jump is necessary. And as you say, if you realize the importance of the model, you have to be aware that that there is a model. You have to understand maybe its prediction. It's much easier than to derive all the equations sometimes. So deriving equations is not a kind of, someone will do that. But if you are not trained to do so it doesn't mean that you cannot find your way in this community. But the overall way of development should not be that, okay, I have data, okay, now smooth the image and fit it. So that doesn't work anymore. Yeah. In general, I would say that maybe it's a little bit off the subject, but I feel that scientific disciplines are like people. They can be young, mature, and old. And initially, I started actually in a field which was beautiful, but it was old. It was elementary particle physics. Old means all the problems are solved and you have really unsolvable huge problems, or maybe a few of them. Okay, now Higgs boson is discovered. What first?
Nothing to do with, nothing left to do. Right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's it. And whatever one does cannot be validated. So there is no chance to validate things. So that's the problem. It's then old science, it's like old people, so they have problems. I would say that our field was young about 30 years maybe, when you have low-hanging fruits. You can collect them, you have to be clever enough to collect them, but there are some. And now there is this transition when we are mature, so we have to look how other scientific disciplines work, and that is what is applied to us as well. Looking back in history, Dmitry already recalled more engineering development, which is understandable. Of course, you have to develop the basic things first. And maybe even the first series, there was some pioneering work long ago, but really the first kind of broad interest in microstructure before this work appears was fMRI actually. The question, why do we see that? What was the physiological mechanism behind the signal change in fMRI? It was the 1990s, like 30 or 25 years after the development, or after the first MRI images. So now we are mature as science, and the science means you have theory, you have experiment, you have applications. So it's like a developed structure.
It's not a random walk in parameter space.
Exactly. Fitting landscape.
Yeah, I mean,
yes.
After reading a few of your articles, and I mean, I couldn't help but receive the message that the most common research practices are getting away from the roots of science. It's kind of inevitable to miss. And I definitely see where it is coming from. And there is this slapping deep learning AI methods to any kind of research question is almost like a reflex these days. But I guess some of these problems are going to remain to be solved, even if we had all the data in the world and all the computational power to process it. But on the other hand, it is more likely that this is physics versus fitting. And it is more likely that there will be more people on the fitting side of the things, right? We will probably have more bikers than ski jumpers. I don't know if that knowledge still holds. And do you think that in that community, at least, taking 5 to foster the reproducibility of these efforts by bringing transparency to the way these studies are performed and the way the results are published can benefit us more than trying to make things better or faster? What do you think? And what do you think about the role of publishers in this aspect as well? I guess that's also important, right? If it's because these methods are really heavily demanding on the computational methods, so and reproducibility and reliability of them are quite based on the transparency aspect.
Do you mean by transparency what kind of models or software is used, or
exposing what has been used to do that specific work, all the code data, the transparency aspects? Do you think that taking a pause and spending a bit more time on these things can be more valuable than trying to move forward in the realm of fitting?
So you're talking about representations in a way, not even strictly speaking.
I would say everything, actually.
Both can.
Well, one kind of transparency is declaring whether it's a model or a representation, right? That's kind of the first step in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's a model, then you probably increase the reproducibility rather than decrease it. If it's, I mean, once it's validated anyway.
Yeah, sure. It should be possible to reproduce all the data, use the code, and so on. And I'm not sure how exactly about the rules, but I heard that, for example, the CERN data, if you are a member of the community, you can access and reprocess whatever possible there.
Mm-hmm.
You can create your own theory and try to validate it using measurements which were done years ago. Why not learning from them?
Yes, but I think the community is moving along that direction already. I would say that there is maybe, I guess, there is reproducibility. People spend a lot. It's a popular topic, say data harmonization. If I measure it on a GE versus on a Siemens, or Prisma versus Skyra, and they harmonizing a rod, and of course you want to publish this code, but that's usually the code with tons of adjustable parameters. You may teach a neural network to transfer one type of measurement to the other. There is this whole field of data harmonization that is now kind of being discussed. And I can maybe say something provocative here, is that the best data harmonization is a correct, well validated by a physical model, because it kind of compresses our data into the smallest possible number of degrees of freedom, usually non-linearly depending on inputs. And so what if we started to focus more on developing and understanding and validating assumptions behind non-trivial models, rather than just blindly trying to transfer the data from one platform to the other? Mm-hmm. Because, think about it. If you buy a voltmeter, you really don't care whether it's made by GE or Mitsubishi or whatever. As long as there is specification that it does measure voltage with this precision, you almost don't mind. You look at the price, right? So if you have a correct model and robust non-degenerate parameter estimation scheme, I don't care which scanner you use. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's the ultimate harmonization, reproducibility, call it whatever, is if we have a knowledge base of well-validated models, a kind of a community that has a common ground about what we know well, and of course what we kind of don't know. Their boundaries of knowledge are always fuzzy, but within a certain core of what we know well, almost everyone then can say, well, look, use this parameter estimation scheme. Of course, you need to calibrate your scanner on phantom, gradients should be performing well, etc. Those are standard things, not very expensive and not very difficult as of today. But other than that, use these tools and you will get the same, axonal water fraction, whether you measure it at 1.5 Tesla on the GE or the 3 Tesla on the Siemens. That I think would be a triumph of science. That's, to me, a truly quantitative microstructural MR. And I think we can get there.
Dmitry, I'm afraid that I'm lagging a little bit behind the development, but I'm afraid that still we have this inheritance of good old lucid world of NMR, where relaxation was mono-exponential, diffusion Gaussian. And that's why even if you enter the B value in the scanner, it doesn't ask you about the diffusion time. Mm-hmm. So even it's much simpler than validating a model with just, that diffusion depends on both gradient and time. And if your scanner have just only one scale for B, surely you have a problem of normalization.
Oh yeah, yeah.
It's just simple. I mean, much simpler than what Dmitry says.
Yeah. But that's a communication favorite. Agar's work.
Yeah, I know if you
to the scanner manufacturers as well. Yeah.
Yes, I know a few people who has measured B value, just developed a pipeline to get real B value with account for all imaging gradients and whatever possible. Just starting to work on this in this topic.
Yeah, I agree. I guess this is one of the biggest advantages of trying to come up with a transparent implementation sharing platform among the community, so that we can have access to unified implementation of the sequences, that we can tweak more parameters that we actually need to have access to. And I also get the message about how you approach reproducibility, and I think this is a really different message than we got kind of used to hearing. So thank you so much for those remarks. It's been an hour. If you still like to move on, maybe we can talk about a few more things. It's up to you. If you have time, I'm really happy to keep talking to you. I can do this for hours. So yeah, cool. Maybe I can ask one question to Sune. We also observe this a lot in the field of myelin mapping, and actually I grabbed a popcorn and reading a heated debate on Twitter about the promise of myelin imaging biomarkers. And there was a review article, and we are also observing that there are many studies published, and they are showing correlations with histology images to some extent, but the values are all over the map. And there is, as you say in the article, there is nothing in these quantitative maps that immediately alert us and pushes us towards questioning its meaning. And then when we try to search for the one imaging method that works well and trying to steer our efforts in that direction, we are having lots of difficulties trying to find that. So is there any way to change the game before this planet of parametric mapping collapses under its own gravity is going to be my next question to Sune.
To me? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is I guess this is overall what the paper addresses in some sense, right? I mean, that we need to focus more on modeling than representations, because the thing is, if the basic, let's say the basic diffusion signal has a sensitivity to some biological parameter, and you make a representation which fits that parameter, then if you apply basically the same measurement scheme, then it's kind of natural that in some, at least some smaller variation of this biological parameter will also reflect in the representation parameter by itself, right? The problem is that once you go outside of this, either for a pathology or to a different scanner or whatever, and then this may break down. It may be a different parameter, or it may be a combination of parameters. But the only way to get out of this explosion, if you will, of correlation, I suppose this is what you mean, right?
Yeah.
Is by developing the correct model or the correct theory, because then you know exactly which parameters are sensitive to which biological parameters and under which circumstances. And then you will validate this. I mean, the other thing, I mean, this again, this will also here you should maybe also draw upon the prediction power of models, I think, because the models could also would also predict that you could correlate this under a different type of measurement, for example, isotropic diffusion encoding or what have you. Whereas once you change something for representation, you will lose this correlation.
You have to reestablish it again,
yes,
as if it's a new experiment. Yes.
And I think this is also important for other fields looking at different organs, because when a new application is planning to use these diffusion methods, the first avenue that they check is definitely brain imaging. And I observed this closely, for example, for musculoskeletal diffusion imaging. And then after a few years, once it is noticed that we can probe some sort of microstructure, then I started to see more studies about what's the meaning of FA in, for example, skeletal muscle. And then I saw different experiments changing a few things, and FA increased. Okay, here, FA decreased. And after a while, I was really not able to extract a one coherent message out of all these things so that I can really understand the role of these many metrics and how they relate to my tissue microstructure. And it's, again, probably the modeling problem, because if we are trying to come up with a model within a different tissue, so we also need to update our theory and everything in that regard, right?
I think you had a good slide showing this also, where you had an example of kurtosis changing, which could be due to many different things, whereas a model can have a better hope of isolating these things to specific biological parameters.
Yeah, and this can propagate into other sub-communities and other research fields only if we started from ourselves. I guess that's the
That's why we wrote this article.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's see.
It's not to say, if I might just add, it's not to say that it's not useful to correlate things with representational parameters. We just have to understand the limitations, and it doesn't mean because we have shown in one study that this correlates with whatever myelin or whatever, then this parameter is a myelin marker. That's where the danger is. I mean, that is an invalid conclusion for a representation parameter.
So
but it can still be useful to know that that myelin affects this parameter, right? But it doesn't mean that the parameter is myelin.
And Valerie, do you think this is picking up low-hanging fruits? Like after keep doing these studies for many different experimental settings.
It depends, yes, whether we talk about the present time or the past. I would say that in this analogy, so you enter new land, like you discover a new continent, and of course, first you collect the low-hanging fruits. But if you already came where some couple, like a few hundred people were before you, usually you don't find such an obvious thing, but you try to look around. You just try to look around and see what is where I am, actually. And maybe these first studies of correlating things with things, it's a way to look around to see, okay, where we are, we can measure, we can get some dependencies. Maybe it is a kind of necessary initial phase. But after that, there should be a little bit deeper approach where you really create a model which maybe unify these different parameters. Maybe it tells you that they are not so much different. Maybe they are different phases of the same thing. And then this huge number of representation parameters will collapse, but not in the black hole, but in a few proper parameters. So that will be today, because before you would be happy collecting things easily, relatively easily. You rather create methods for collecting things than.
And I guess it's really difficult to know when should we stop exploring. I mean, when should we stop collecting experimental data for a particular new method, right? And
you never know, of course. If there is someone who is trying to build theory, maybe too early at some moment, but with more data, it will be right on time. So it's a community. You cannot do everything alone. So everybody tries to do what one can.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's why I really believe that this kind of panels, meetings, and any communication platforms are really, really useful.
Okay.
All right. So These were all my questions, but if there is anything you'd like to open up for discussion, I'm all for it. It's been 1 hour and 15 minutes. What do you think? Is there anything else that you'd like to
Well,
add?
one thing was just coming to my mind about this, how to, you had this question about how to build this positive feedback loop and how to maybe spread out this way of thinking about modeling and kind of a basic science approach. And one thing I also think that I'm not sure we touched upon was that I think part of it is also bringing back um, earlier in the educational system that this field is actually an interesting field also from a fundamental point of view. For example, in biology departments or physics departments, that there's actually a challenging and fundamental problems here that, for example, physicists can attack, and this can be done by offering courses or giving talks in physics department and things like this, and writing textbooks in about MRI in a language that's about microstructure modeling and MRI in a language which is familiar to physicists. Yeah, I just wanted to put that in there as well.
Yeah, where you don't start with the p-value or how many millitesla per meter you have as a gradient, but you talk about the diffusion, the restrictions, the picture. You draw the pictures, and
Exactly.
the pictures are universally. They kind of they're interesting to so many people, right? You don't need to know intricacies of NMR sequences and stuff. Yes, it's true. We have to really open up our community to sort of to fundamental physics, to neuroscience, to biology.
Yeah, exactly. Looking from outside on our communities, I mean, this communication is still not working properly, I would say.
Yeah, sometimes I think we're almost the prisoners of our own success because MRI has been so important in the clinic. Obviously, we all work at research hospitals rather than at, I don't know, physics departments usually, right? We almost, maybe not us, maybe our predecessors, for decades maybe didn't feel enough need to reestablish this communication because life sciences are relatively well funded. You know exactly the need for these devices. There's nobody's questioning why this new coils are being developed and whatnot. And somehow we need to still, now that we're becoming, as Valery likes to say, mature scientific discipline, we need to recharge our batteries and sort of reestablish the connections to mature scientific fields that we sort of work in parallel with, whether it's neuroscience or whether it's, say, condensed matter physics, physics of diffusion in random media, for instance, right? So, and that communication maybe hasn't truly happened. I think, if anything, look at us with three implants from physics to MR. We got our education, all of us independently got our education, and what formed us as scientists was different type of physics communities, condensed matter or particle physics community. And we're bringing this fundamental way of thinking into our discipline that is becoming more rigorous and mature. I think somehow I always feel that there should be a two-way process, and between the sort of, let's say, physicists and practitioners here, because there are so many amazingly impactful clinical questions that is only a step away from very difficult physics problem. It's actually quite impressive that you can spend your life working out the corrections to, I don't know, Higgs boson mass or something, and on the other hand, you can spend your few years deriving a formula with very fancy methods and then take it to a hospital next door. So this is a remarkable feature ISMRM, a remarkable feature for our community that I don't think is well appreciated by either fundamental physics or, say, neuroscience or biology. We really need to start talking to them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So if there is not anything else you'd like to add, I think that concludes our panel for today.
Okay.
Right.
All right. It was a pleasure to meet you, and thank you so much for taking your time and for your detailed answers. It was a pleasure, and hope to see you again, maybe in real life in one of the conferences in 2 years. Who knows?
We do appreciate it.
Yes.
Much more.
Yes. Yes, there's a Gordon conference on tissue microstructure imaging in July in the summer that is still on. It's still planned, and it's planned still to be an in-person event.
It's been cancelled and not yet planned. Exactly on this time.
It is planned. I'm planning it. It is planned. It looks awesome. It looks really awesome, and that's the whole idea. Has been Greg Stanish was actually the inventor of this idea, Gordon conference, where we would actually have different imaging modalities: X-ray, EM, super resolution optics, ultrasound,
really fancy. Where
MR.
The location?
So it is 18th to 23rd of July, not far from Boston. Gordon conference. You can Google it, tissue microstructure imaging 2021 July.
Oh, I can. Okay, cool.
So the program will appear probably next month online.
Well, best of luck. I hope things gonna get better.
I hope it will not be derailed. It's gonna be fun. All
right. Once again, thank you so much. It was a pleasure, and have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.